Welcome to Stories with Facts. We're diving deep today into a really intense period of the Gaza conflict, February 2024.
Yeah.
You've given us a ton of sources on this.
Sure have.
News articles, timelines, even a Britannica encyclopedia entry.
Wow.
It seems like you really want to understand if this was like a turning point in the conflict.
It's a fascinating question, and I think going into February, the conflict, which, remember, started back in October of 2023,
Right.
it was already incredibly volatile, but things were about to get much, much worse.
Yeah, it feels like before February, most of the fighting was airstrikes, rocket attacks, that kind of thing.
Right.
But then in February, the ground war really ratchets up. The Indian Express timeline mentioned some major IDF offensives in Gaza City,
Yes.
in Khan Younis, aimed at, disrupting Hamas infrastructure,
Yeah.
especially those tunnel networks.
Exactly. And in fact, on February 7th, 2024, a truly horrifying incident occurred in Khan Younis.
Yeah.
According to a report by The Print, Hamas fighters disguised as, get this, IDF soldiers infiltrated a kibbutz, killing over 100 civilians.
That's awful.
It was a major escalation in tactics and brutality, and really sets the tone for the entire month of February.
It's hard to imagine the level of violence at this point.
Absolutely.
The YouTube video, Israel-Gaza Conflict Timeline, highlights that by February 10th alone, the death toll in Gaza had already surpassed 35,000.
Right.
And most of them civilians.
The vast majority, absolutely. The human cost was just staggering. And that scale of destruction, the displacement,
Right.
it led to a complete humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The Xinhua news agency was using terms like catastrophic and famine to describe the situation. Can you imagine 2.5 million people displaced, crammed into shelters with limited access to food, clean water, medical care?
It's heartbreaking. And then you add the challenges of getting aid into the region.
Right.
And it just seems unimaginable.
Yeah.
Several sources, including that English.news timeline and the China.org.cn timeline,
Yes.
they talk about immense difficulties faced by aid convoys.
Huge challenges. You have the ongoing fighting, which obviously makes it incredibly dangerous.
Right.
But then you have the Israeli security restrictions.
Right, which they argued were, necessary to prevent weapons from reaching Hamas.
Of course.
But also it hampered the flow of aid.
Yes, absolutely. And then on top of all of that, there were even accusations from sources like First Post that Hamas was diverting aid for their own military purposes.
Wow.
It was a moral and logistical quagmire.
And as if things weren't bad enough within Gaza, February also saw the conflict begin to spread.
It did. On February 11th, Hezbollah launched a barrage of rockets from Lebanon into northern Israel,
Yeah.
killing 13 civilians in the town of Nahariya, according to the Jerusalem Post. This marked a significant escalation of Hezbollah's involvement in the conflict.
It really does feel like Iran was playing a big role in escalating things at this point.
Without a doubt, the Feb24.pdf document, for example, explicitly details how Iran was supplying Hamas and Hezbollah with weapons. Increasingly sophisticated weapons, by the way, and providing them with financial support.
So you have this, proxy war element emerging. All these different actors
Exactly.
with their own agendas fueling the conflict. It just makes it that much more complex.
Precisely. And then, in the midst of all of this chaos, comes February 14th.
Right.
What many consider one of the most shocking events of the entire conflict.
The Rafah Market airstrike.
Exactly.
It felt like that was the one that really caught international attention.
It did. On February 14th, the Israeli Air Force conducted an airstrike on what they claimed to be a Hamas weapons depot,
Okay.
located near the Rafah Market. However, the strike resulted in massive civilian casualties.
Yeah.
Over 200 people were killed, hundreds more injured.
And the international outcry was immediate, right?
Immediate and fierce.
Okay.
Even countries that have been traditionally supportive of Israel, like the United States, expressed serious concerns, condemned the strike.
It did seem like a turning point in terms of global public opinion.
It was. Raised serious questions about proportionality in warfare and adherence to international law.
The Jerusalem Post, though, they offer a different perspective.
Yeah.
They highlight Israel's claim that they had credible intelligence suggesting a Hamas weapons cache was being stored in the area.
Right. And that's an important reminder that in a conflict like this, there are always multiple narratives. It's crucial to try to understand the motivations and justifications of all sides.
Absolutely. But even with those justifications, it's hard to ignore the scale of the tragedy.
It is, especially given that it came on the heels of weeks of already horrific violence.
Right.
It definitely contributed to a sense that the situation was spiraling out of control and that something had to change.
And it seems like maybe that realization, combined with all the international pressure, might have shifted things, at least diplomatically.
Yeah.
Towards the end of February, you start to see some movement towards a possible ceasefire.
We do. Egypt and Qatar started stepping up their efforts to mediate between Israel and Hamas.
The Explain.co article has a really interesting breakdown of those negotiations.
Oh, they were very delicate and complex, with so much mistrust between the two sides.
Yeah.
Israel was demanding Hamas's complete disarmament as a precondition for a ceasefire, while Hamas insisted on the full lifting of the Israeli blockade on Gaza. These were, and still are, seemingly irreconcilable positions.
So even with this push for diplomacy, things were still incredibly precarious as February came to a close.
They were. It was a month that started with a surge in violence and ended with a glimmer of hope.
Right.
However fragile that hope may have been. And, the conflict's impact wasn't confined to just the immediate region either. It was starting to have serious global economic repercussions.
Right. The Feb24.pdf document really goes into how energy markets were going haywire. Oil prices were fluctuating wildly because the stability of the entire region was in question.
Exactly. And you also can't forget about the disruption to shipping routes through the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, that's a major artery for global trade. And the conflict was essentially creating a huge bottleneck. Delays were piling up, costs were skyrocketing.
Yeah.
Everything from electronics to food was being affected.
It's like that old saying, no man is an island.
Right.
Or in this case, no region is an island.
Yeah.
One of the timelines even mentions that the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, issued a warning about a potential global economic slowdown if the fighting continued.
Yeah, it suddenly became very real for people far beyond the Middle East.
Yeah.
What was happening in Gaza was showing up as price increases at the supermarket, or maybe even job losses in industries reliant on those supply chains.
So looking back, it's undeniable that February 2024 was a month of escalation across the board. Military, humanitarian, diplomatic, and now we see the economic angle as well.
Right.
But the big question still remains, was it a turning point?
That is the million-dollar question. It's tough to say definitively.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have that horrifying intensification of the conflict, the massive casualties, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the spread of violence to Lebanon, even rumblings on the Israel-Syria border.
And yet we also see the beginnings of a push towards some kind of diplomacy. Egypt and Qatar really trying to broker a ceasefire, even those brief truces in late February to allow some aid through.
Yeah, and I think what's important to remember is that history rarely gives us neat and tidy turning points in real time. Sometimes it takes years, even decades, to look back and recognize those moments where things truly shifted.
So we might not be able to give a clear yes or no answer to the turning point question just yet.
Right.
But based on all these sources that you've given us, what do you think?
Yeah.
What are some of the most important takeaways?
For me, a few things really stand out. Firstly, I think it underscores that even in the 21st century, we're still dealing with these very deep-rooted conflicts. History, identity, land, resources, they all factor in, and finding solutions is incredibly complex. It's like we have all these modern tools and technology.
We do.
But some of the core issues driving conflict, they really haven't changed that much.
You're absolutely right. And the second takeaway, which we've kind of touched on already, is that interconnectedness we were just talking about.
Right.
What happens in one corner of the world can really have ripple effects globally. Whether it's the economy, security, or even just the news we consume, we are all linked.
So even if a conflict feels, far away, it can still have a very real impact on our lives.
Absolutely. And finally, I think the sources really drive home a point that can get lost in all the, geopolitical maneuvering and strategizing.
Yeah.
And that is, behind every headline, every statistic, there are human beings whose lives are being shattered by this conflict.
It's so easy to get caught up in the strategy, the politics, the analysis.
Right.
But ultimately, this is about people. Families torn apart, homes destroyed, lives lost. And that human cost, I think, needs to be at the forefront of any attempt to understand and hopefully one day resolve this conflict.
Yeah, it's a lot to absorb, for sure. We've covered so much ground here, and I know this can be heavy stuff.
Yeah, it is, but it's also incredibly important, you know? And this is where I think it becomes so crucial to actually connect these events back to you, the listener.
Right. We've been, digging into all this history, analyzing these sources.
Yeah.
But what does it all mean for someone who's just trying to understand the world today?
That's the key question. Well, first off, I think February 2024 really highlights the limitations of traditional diplomacy. We saw those efforts by Egypt and Qatar.
Right.
But the core issues were just so entrenched, it was almost impossible to bridge the gap.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder if there are different approaches, maybe less conventional ones,
Yeah,
that could be more effective in these kinds of conflicts.
absolutely. That's a question worth exploring for sure. And then there's, the whole economic angle we talked about. This idea that a conflict seemingly over there can have such a direct impact on your daily life here.
Yeah.
It really underscores how interconnected the world is.
Right. You might be thinking, okay, so oil prices fluctuate,
Yeah.
shipping gets delayed, like, what can I do about it?
Right.
That's a totally fair question.
It is.
But maybe just awareness is, like, the first step.
Absolutely.
Understanding those connections can influence how we vote,
Yes.
how we consume,
Right.
even how we talk about these issues.
Exactly. Informed citizens are crucial. And lastly, I think the human element is
Okay.
something we really can't let fade into the background. It's so easy to become numb to the statistics, the headlines.
Totally. But those are real people whose lives are being ended, destroyed even.
Right.
And maybe that's like the biggest takeaway of all. It's a call to empathy, to trying to understand the human stories behind the conflict.
And not just understand, but to act.
Yeah.
Whether it's, supporting humanitarian organizations,
Right.
advocating for policy changes, or even just engaging in thoughtful conversations about these issues, each of us can play a role.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I want to leave you with a thought. We focused on February 2024,
Right.
but this conflict, it's still unfolding.
It is.
It's dynamic, it's complex, and it's going to continue to have ripple effects.
Without a doubt. Keep learning, keep questioning, and most importantly, stay engaged. The world needs informed, compassionate citizens now more than ever.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into February 2024 in Gaza. Until next time, keep seeking out those stories and keep uncovering the facts.